Hello, students. Welcome back. We are going to get into Chapter 9. This is actually Chapter 9, Part 1, and this is Expansion in the Industrial Age. Here you see the key terms for this portion of the lecture. And here are our lecture questions. What is imperialism and how is it carried out? How does the Second Industrial Revolution expand imperialist conquest? And what is deindustrialization and how does it benefit imperialist countries? All right, let's begin. Okay, so we're going to talk about imperialism now. And imperialism, similar to colonialism, is basically the spreading of a country into other parts of the world. In this case, you're talking about a time period in which you have an expansion of industrialization, and you also have the United States that is starting to play a factor in some of these imperialist ambitions. The main motivator here is an effort to have as many markets to sell to and access to as many resources as possible. So you're going to want to have trading partnerships and you're going to want to have access to markets. And this can be done, obviously, by agreement, or it can also be done by force. And it was done both ways. But the United States and European countries, by the time we get to, well, especially European countries by the mid-19th century, US more by the late 19th century, are really feeling emboldened to go out into the world and establish themselves as dominant economic forces. And this is really being driven in many ways by racist ideologies, by political and economic ambition. All right, so what was really driving this imperialist expansion were the technologies that were coming out of the first industrial revolution. So the first industrial revolution is roughly the time period between 1750 and 1850. And this is when people power are going to be replaced by machinery and in this case steam engines. And so it's the process by which human beings harness steam power in order to create machines for work purposes and also for manufacturing purposes. The first industrial revolution begins in England, where large coal deposits were discovered. And the coal, of course, was burned in order to heat the water to create the steam that would then run the engines. And then, of course, that spreads to other areas as well. So steam-powered pumps, steam-powered locomotives to drive trains, steam ships, of course, to drive ships, motorized reapers, which are harvesting tools for agriculture, so no longer needing to use human power to do that. Spinning jennies and flying shuttles. Spinning jennies were big spools of thread. They would spin big spools of thread so that it no longer needed to be done by hand. Flying shuttles were mechanized weaving machines, so they could take that thread and weave it. So both spinning jennies and flying shuttles were huge in the textile industry, and the textile industry is going to boom coming out of the first industrial revolution. And then the telegraph machine, which will be invented at the latter end of the first industrial revolution, right around 1844. And this, of course, revolutionizes communication as well. So all of these changes, which take place in a relatively short period of time of over just 100 years, is really going to revolutionize and change the way that people live and work. It's going to create commodities that are going to be affordable, but it's also going to create the wage worker, the person that is going to have to go to work to make a wage in order to purchase goods to survive. And this is a real shift from a self-sufficient model of living to being dependent upon a boss or a job in order to make your wages so that you can go and buy the things that you need. So the first industrial revolution and then the second industrial revolution, which we will talk about in a minute, both play major roles in really propelling the political and economic conditions that lead to imperialist expansion by Europe and eventually the United States. So while much of the first industrial revolution was focused on taking labor out of human hands and putting it into the hands of machines, the second industrial revolution is really focused on technology and development and just making life easier and more comfortable generally. So it's a natural progression. And one of the first major things to come out of the second industrial revolution is Bessemer steel. And Bessemer steel was a type of steel that was particularly strong, and it was invented in the 1850s and 60s. And the process is essentially where you take pig iron and you heat it to super hot temperatures, and it removes all of the impurities from the iron, and the product that you get coming out is a super strong steel. And steel becomes very important for railways, and also eventually for bridges and skyscrapers in major cities. So the Bessemer process and Bessemer steel really allows for the cities to build up in the late 19th, turn of the 20th century. And then you have rubber, and rubber comes from the rubber tree, which only, of course, grows in certain places in the world. And in 1887, the first pressurized air-filled tire was invented by John Boyd Dunlop. And this invention then is allowing for bicycles to move more efficiently, anything that rolls to move more efficiently, because the old wooden wheel will be replaced with rubber tires. And eventually, of course, this will also be applied to the automobile. The first one credited to a German, Carl Benz, who created basically the prototype for the automobile with a combustion engine. And combustion engine requires fuel to create a combustion process, and then moves the pistons or the rotors or whatever it is moving forward. And so along with the combustion engine, of course, also then comes the demand for fuel for that combustion engine. Steam engines still were around, of course, but the combustion engine will eventually overtake and succumb the steam engine. We also have the electricity, or I should also mention with the automobile was also the bicycle. The bicycle becomes very popular in the 1880s and 90s. It was invented in England in 1885 and becomes particularly popular by the 1890s. The first hydroelectric plant producing electricity is built in 1882, and the light bulb was invented both in England and the U.S. In England in 1878 by Joseph Swan, and in the U.S. by Thomas Edison in 1879. The telephone, of course, which will revolutionize and in many ways overtake the telegraph as the primary mode of communication, long distance, is invented in the U.S. in 1876. In the 1870s, the refrigeration becomes a thing for rail cars, and this really revolutionizes transportation and the ability to transport perishable goods over long distances. And then you have chemical technologies that are going to emerge where you're going to have synthesized fertilizers, dyes, which was huge because prior to that, all dyes and pigments and of all sorts, either in paint or in dyes for clothing or whatever, all came from plants. So to have synthetic dyes was a huge advancement and took away a lot of labor in terms of gathering, and took away the having it be necessary to go out and and harvest plants and grow plants and everything. Fertilizers as well become synthesized and are used to grow plants and optimize plant growing, which of course is going to further agriculture. And then you have the phonograph, which is invented in 1877 by Thomas Edison. And you get the motion picture camera in 1887, which was first invented in France and then later on adopted in the United States. And this is huge just for being able to capture light and sound, to be able to document music and be able to duplicate music and share music. And then the motion picture camera, obviously being able to create movies and entertainment. And by 1900, movies had basically become the most desired form of entertainment, especially in urban areas, both throughout the United States and throughout Europe. So industrialization takes place by the mid-19th century. Industrialization had really taken place in about 5 countries total: Britain, the US, France, Germany, and Belgium. And then as we move forward, other countries are going to begin to industrialize. Canada in 1871 will build the Trans-Canadian Railroad and reach the Pacific. And all of these things are really, changing and transforming the way that people live and work. Russia was one of the exceptions. They are really pretty slow to industrialize, and they won't really begin to industrialize until around 1900. And part of that had to do with the fact that they had really developed a system of feudalism and serfdom in Russia. And it won't be until 1861 that they abolish serfdom. And after they do that, then that sort of frees them up to be able to begin to industrialize and begin to introduce wage workers. Okay, so moving on now to talk about industrialization in other parts of the world. So Japan has kind of a unique and interesting story when it comes to industrialization. The last time we talked about Japan, they were under the Tokugawa shogunate, and essentially they were closed off to the rest of the world, right, with some minor exceptions. And Dejima Harbor, for the most part, they had closed off. They were isolated. They had developed within the country their own culture, their own economy, which was essentially a feudalistic economy. And in 1853, a U.S. naval commodore Commodore Perry, will sail into Tokyo Harbor with the intent of forcefully opening up Tokyo's trading partnerships with the United States. And he goes into the harbor and he decides to fire blanks at the harbor and threaten Japan with essentially with war if they don't open up their borders for trade. And so this is like a huge, obviously a shock, but also a very aggressive move by the Americans. In 1854, a convention had concluded between the Americans and the Japanese. This is the Convention of Tanagawa. And essentially, the Japanese are forced essentially to agree to trade with the United States and also to give assistance to any American ships that might need help or might be in distress in the Western Pacific. And it's at that time that things really start to begin to change in Japan. The shogunate starts to lose some of its political power and influence. People start to not be as confident in the shogunate. And people are wanting to see a modernization of Japan. And so the Tokugawa shogunate, after some time, by 1869, will give way to the Meiji Restoration. And the Meiji Restoration is a period of time in Japanese history where there's going to be aggressive industrialization taking place. So almost to like compensate or make up for the time lost that Japan was isolated, they decide to implement a very aggressive industrialization process. Mitsubishi will be the first Zaibatsu, which is essentially a family-owned, vertically integrated company in which they'll have a large influence. Typically, they're large in size and they have a large influence in Japan. And Mitsubishi starts off as a shipping company. Later on, it becomes a car manufacturer and other things. But Mitsubishi is the first of many Zaibatsus, which are like these, like I said, family-owned companies. And this basically will be the foundation of the corporate structure of Japanese companies moving forward. The other thing that happens during the the Meiji Restoration is the abolishment of feudalism. So as I mentioned, that it was essentially a feudal economy, and just to remind folks that feudalism is essentially a system on which there is a lord or a landowner that has a bunch of people that are tied to the land that they own, that the landlord owns, and they're essentially forced to work the land in order to survive. So their complete survival depends upon this landlord or this feudal lord. And the reason why it can be very stifling is then it does not allow for people to leave the land to go out and be wage earners and perhaps engage in industrialized economies. And so in order for countries to industrialize, they really have to shed their feudal systems in order for the industrial system to work. So they abolish feudalism under the Meiji Restoration and replace all of the domains of the samurai, or the shoguns and the samurai, and all of those sort of old elite castes of people in Japan they replaced those domains with prefectures. And those prefectures are still in existence today in Japan. Um, and then finally, they adopt a public school system where, people are um, sort of obligated to go and get educated. Children are educated, and this is laying the foundation for there to be an educated working class in Japan. By 1900, as you can see from the slide, Japan was well on its way to being a strong industrial nation. So Japan's a very unique case in that the industrialization process was very much driven from the top down, and also that they were able to industrialize very rapidly. Okay, so while the United States, Europe, and Japan were industrializing, there were many parts of the world that were not industrializing. Africa, Latin America, Asian countries. And why did this happen is a question that a lot of historians have asked. And it appears that in many cases, it seems to be that there was an attempt by a lot of these industrialized countries to essentially ensure that they did not have competition from other parts of the world. An example of that would be the British in India, where industrialization was stopped purposely by the British with, for example, the passing of the Calico Act. And the Calico Act prohibited textiles from anywhere but England. So essentially, what they're doing is they're saying um, there can be no industry within India, which they had a very robust, textile industry, and essentially the Calico Act prohibited them from selling it to anybody but England. And this, of course, then doesn't allow for India itself to build up its own economy. So essentially, India becomes an export economy of cotton and sugar and opium and other products like that. Another example would be the British in Egypt, where the British forced Muhammad Ali of the convention at the Convention of London in 1840 to reduce his army, dissolve his navy, and give up all territory he had gained outside of Egypt and Sudan. And in exchange for that, he got the right to establish a hereditary rule for his family, but he essentially had to bow to the British government and agree to demilitarize. In Latin America, a lot of Latin American countries found imported products to be cheaper than what they could afford to make. And so they continued to be an exporter of coffee and sugar. And at the same time, foreign banks really get involved in Latin America, loaning them money for infrastructure projects and things like that, which essentially kept them in debt. And remember, we talked about Latin America and Latin American revolutions, beginning with the Mexican Revolution for independence, but then other Latin American countries followed suit. And pretty soon, the entire continent of South America basically had declared its independence from Spain. And but at the same time, they still needed money in order to build up their infrastructure. So lots of foreign investment in Latin America essentially, like I said, kept them in a state of debt. And China kind of failed to industrialize for a lot of different reasons. There was a huge competition by European nations to come into China and exploit it for its resources. It also had a large population and a large geography that made it difficult to start industrialization projects. So China also does not industrialize at the same rate that the European and United States um, did. So all of these are examples of deindustrialization, and this is a process basically to ensure that a colony is not in direct economic competition with its colonizer. And so, in order to do this, you turn that region of the world into an export economy, meaning that basically their worth lies in their exports and not in their um, production, what they can actually produce. Um, so that's one of the reasons why certain areas of the world, like Latin America and Africa, for example, have had a hard time moving into the modern economy because both of those areas had to deal with large-scale colonial and imperialistic projects by Europe and by the United States. All right. So a good example of deindustrialization or oppression of countries by European powers is the China Opium Wars. So Britain had established a colony in India and had a trading partnership with China, particularly for tea and porcelain and silks. And unfortunately for the British really didn't have anything that the Chinese wanted. And the Chinese really were only taking silver currency. So, in order to compensate for this trade imbalance, the British Empire figured out a way to kind of circumvent this through the opium trade. They discovered that they were able to grow opium in India and take that opium over to China and then trade it for the goods that they wanted. And opium was not legal in China. And in fact, the government over time started to realize that this was a real problem, opium being the base ingredient in things like heroin and morphine. Extremely addictive substance. And so in 1839, um, the Chinese emperor decides that they are going to crack down on the opium trade, sends a letter to Queen Victoria asking her to halt the opium trade, never gets a response, but definitely puts it on the radar of the British that the Chinese are not wanting this trade to take place. All of this culminates in the first Opium Wars that take place from 1839 to 1842. The Chinese fought very hard to expel the British, essentially, but ultimately they are going to lose because the British had a very powerful navy. They had more modernized weapons, and this will result in a treaty in which Britain will get Hong Kong and 5 other port cities. The port cities were there essentially just as trading ports. Now, remember, prior to this, there was only one trading port that was available to Europeans, and that was in Canton. So this is a huge opening up of China to the West. And in 1844, China signs treaties. China is forced to sign, I should say, treaties with France and the US, giving them access to ports as well as the British and Christian missionary projects, right? So the Chinese, similar to the Japanese, really had tried to prevent Christians from coming into China to missionize. And this particular treaty in 1844 will allow that to happen. And then the Second Opium War breaks out, and that happens from 1856 to 1860. And this ultimately will lead to the Treaty of Tanjing, which will again make more concessions to both the British, other European powers, and the United States. This begins what the Chinese call a century of humiliation, essentially feeling as if they are being oppressed by the West, and this ultimately will lead in the long run to the Chinese Revolution and the end of the Qing Empire. But in the meantime, the British and all the other European powers are going to come away with favorable trade advantages here in China. And Britain will actually hold on to Hong Kong until 1997. So this is a long haul for the Chinese. During the Second Opium Wars, the Chinese were also dealing with an uprising that lasted 14 years throughout China called the Taiping Rebellion. It started in 1850 and ended in 1864, and this further weakened the Qing dynasty when they were trying to fight the Second Opium Wars. Hong Xingquan was a Chinese man who had converted to Christianity, and he claimed to have these visions and claimed to be the Son of God. He spread his ideas throughout southeastern China, and basically over time gained a very large following. He essentially wanted to overthrow the Qing dynasty, and his forces and his followers will rage through southern China, occupying cities. And when it is all said and done, between 20 and 30 million people will die from the violence and the famine and the political chaos that ensues by the end of the rebellion in 1864. So this just represents how the Western influence in China is really having a major impact culturally. And of course, this rebellion will cause all types of internal chaos that will weaken the Qing dynasty and make it even more difficult for them to fight back European pressures. So this quest for profit by industrialized nations in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, will really lead to forced military conquests. Their quest is really for raw materials needed for industrialization. Things like oil, things like rubber, things like palm oil, which was required for lubrication of large machinery, copper for electricity and conducting electricity, silver for both medicine and photography. Silver was used. Lead for pipes, coal, of course, to run steam engines, ivory for pianos, and pianos were becoming more and more popular with the middle class during this time period. And of course, all of the classic ones like tea, coffee, sugar, Exotic wood became very desirable, things like mahogany, rosewood, ebony. And industrialized nations really needed these raw materials to be cheap. And so it was to their advantage to go into these places with their military forces, occupy them, colonize them. And basically, for the most part, many of these places in Asia and in Africa, they were not settler colonies, meaning people from Europe were not going there and settling. They were just going there to exploit the resources and to exploit the labor. So, sort of the philosophical or moral underpinning, if there is one, to this activity really had to do with this idea of civilizing the peoples of the world. There was obviously a very strong held belief in European superiority. This is also true for the United States. And there's a sense of duty to transform uncivilized people. Rudyard Kipling wrote a book called The White Man's Burden, and this was in 1899. And he argues in this book that through religion and education and Western style clothing and character building and Western values, and by bringing all of these things to these corners of the world, this will basically help people and help them become more civilized. This is also sort of based on the very popular notions of social Darwinism at this time, which that people are stronger or more powerful because they are inherently superior. There's this sort of sense of industrial superiority. Um, Typically, people, non-European people, would have been looked at as sort of like half child or half devil, not really a complete person. And there was all of it. Eventually, this social Darwinist theory will kind of move into more of a eugenics movement where people are talking about superiority based on genetics, right? And trying to look for, physical indicating factors that prove superiority. It's a real sort of pseudoscience that emerges, but it comes out of this belief of, superiority of European people and people from the United States. And so this is really creating the foundation for cultural conquest. And in many cases, the cultural conquest actually happens first, before the colonization or before the annexation of a particular territory. So, a perfect example of cultural conquest is the missionizing projects, right? The missionaries. And the missionaries are sent out by the churches, by either Protestant churches or Catholic churches, out into the world, out to different parts of the world to convert these uncivilized, in quotation, people of the world. And the idea is, right, that you're saving souls. There's this element of salvation, but at the end of the day, what ends up happening is a lot of cultural traditions are stripped from these places. Oftentimes, when the missionaries would come, they would insist upon Western style clothing, for example, in order to attend church. Or they might insist that you speak English, or whatever their European dialect was. And so it basically over time, because of this conversion process, can lead to a forgetting of, cultural traditions. And it might have been, at least initially, a willful forgetting because you wanted to do this conversion, but ultimately, a generation or two out, it could be a complete destruction of and a complete um, erasure of that particular culture. So it's a dangerous proposition, right? And I can give you a very good example in the island nation of Hawaii. In the early 19th century, missionaries started to arrive. And at that time, there was a ruling family and a monarchy. And the monarchy, as soon as they converted to Christianity, um, everything in Hawaii will end up changing, right? More Americans will come, and these were American missionaries that came to Hawaii. And basically, over time, the Americans will come, they'll establish themselves. Um, the missionary families become very rich and powerful over a couple of generations. And ultimately, what's going to happen there is there's going to be a forced overthrow of the monarchy at the end of the 19th century and an annexation of the island nation. With the protest of the queen at the time, Queen Liliuokalani. So that is an example of how the missionaries came first, and then slowly over time, in a generation or two, basically, the entire culture was overcome and succumbed by foreigners. So missionaries are very much part of laying that cultural conquest that often comes first with these projects. Okay, so the final thing we're going to talk about today is the means of imperialism. So, for a long time, Europeans had been exploring, going all the way back, to the 15th century, to the 1400s with the Portuguese explorers and everything. And so, why the 19th century? Why that century to be the big, imperialistic push? And the short answer is essentially developments, both in medicine and also in technology and military weapons, right? So the very first thing that comes about in the 1840s is quinine. And quinine was essentially a medicine um, that allowed for people to have a type of immunity, a resistance to malaria. And so many of these places that we are talking about where Europeans and Americans wanted to travel were tropical places where a lot of malaria and mosquitoes and things existed. And that stopped a lot of people from going into those places because oftentimes people would get sick and die. And they knew that. And so when quinine comes about, this then allows for Europeans to have at least some bit of resistance to malaria and allows them to, for example, venture deeper into the interior of Africa. The same can be said for steamboats, right? Africa in particular, but also parts of Asia, have these massive rivers, and it's often, if you don't have a steamboat, it's very difficult to go upriver. And so with the invention of the steamboat in the 1810s, Europeans and Americans are able then to navigate up large rivers, going again into these interior places where they previously had not been. And then finally, the weapon technology, right? Both European and American weapon technology will increase significantly in the 19th century. You have repeating rifles, you have machine guns that will be invented, handguns, Gatling guns, which could fire 3,000 bullets a minute, Maxim gun, which was single-barreled that could shoot 11 bullets per second. And so all of these, military developments are mostly in the hands of Europeans and Americans. And so again, this is allowing them to travel further into Africa, into Indonesia, and down into South America as well. So, for all of these reasons, the 19th century really represents the expansion of European and American, and to a certain extent Japanese, although the Japanese are really focusing on building up their industry. You won't really see them sort of set their sights on conquest until we get right into the 20th century. But this is obviously changing the nature of relationships between countries. It is changing the nature of how industrialization is going to play out. And it definitely is building up these capitalist economies of these Western powers. And that's it for today. All right, see you later.